So let's do this. Mm. Okay, so we are live. Okay. All right. All right, we're going to get started, folks. So let me make sure everything good, good, good. Zoomers, you can see me, hear me? Excellent. All right. So welcome everyone to our first Publishing Triangle monthly reading series. We'll be doing this every month, as I just said. That's what monthly means. So please check out our calendar and see when those upcoming dates are, because I don't have them in my head. Maybe Rob, you have them written down? Maybe. But we're here tonight, and that's what's important. So my name is Greg. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my partner, Donnie. We have the lovely Bonita helping us out, our volunteer. And yeah, thanks for coming out tonight. The Bureau is an all-volunteer organization, so we do have a suggested donation of $10, but we always say, give what you can, if you can. You can also donate by Venmo at BGSQD. So I'll pass this around, even though most of our audience members are readers. So if you can, as I said, I'm going to pass it around. There's cash in there. Another great way to support this fine institution is to buy books from us. So we encourage that as well. And if you have no money whatsoever, just smile and be a kind person, which is a good rule of thumb anyway. So before we get started, and before I have Rob up here, I just wanted to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. And with that, I will welcome Rob Burns to the stage, and we'll get started with this initial Publishing Triangle reading series. Please give it up for Rob.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Bureau of General Services Queer Division, for hosting us tonight and hopefully every month here on. It's a very exciting series that we're starting with the Publishing Triangle. Kind of a little shot of adrenaline that's going on with the organization. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't start by acknowledging the presence of our longtime chair, who's really spurred on a lot of the new energy in the organization, Carol Rosenfeld. Carol? I also, the land acknowledgement, that was, I was in Chicago last week, and we were taking a river architecture cruise, which is really worth it, by the way, if you're ever in Chicago. And the tour guide was talking about the land acknowledgement that was displayed on one of the buildings, and the boat makes the turn and it's gone. So it's like flash in the pan or something, but I'm glad that the Bureau is still doing that. So thank you. I'm going to have more as the program goes on, but I want to say there are other ways you can support the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. They are a nonprofit. They will take your tax deductible charitable contributions. And also the Publishing Triangle would really appreciate people being a member, having all of you join us as a member. It's only $40 a year. And we don't have paid staff, so all that money goes directly into our program. But let's get to the program now. I'll harangue you later with more. Our first reader is William Christie Smith. He's a museum and library professional who's lived in New Orleans for more than 20 years. Although I think his heart is starting to become he's becoming a New Yorker, I think. Previously in Chicago. I missed that altogether. Great. He's working on a second book and has been published in Saints and Sinners, New Fiction from the Festival 6 times. As well as Louisiana Literature, Arkansas Review, and Deep South. I should also add he has just joined the board of directors for the Publishing Triangle, and his birthday is tomorrow. We will not sing him happy birthday because that really doesn't go over well on YouTube. But I want to acknowledge that Chris is finally hitting 35. So. William Christie Smith.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, if anybody in the room has a house that they might like to trade, I live in a very nice area of New Orleans, so it's available. But before I do that, you guys, many of you I know from Saints and Sinners, or that's how I met plenty of you, Carol and Dale and Rob, which is going to happen next March, the final weekend of March. There is an anthology connected to it, and it's really a good way. You know, this system, if you're writing a novel, one of the strategies you can use is to do a short story and get published so you can show something to publishers or whatever. So as they have done every year since time immemorial, they have extended the deadline, and it's now October 31st. So if anybody has any work that they need to get up for consideration, this is a good way to do it. Poetry is October 15th, which is this Sunday. So I'm going to read a story from Louisiana Literature. The backstory is that this is set in the 80s, mid 80s to late 80s. We all know what time frame that was, period of AIDS. And this is a story about somebody who died. He had a lover who has been buried in one of New Orleans' storied cemeteries, but the family will not let this particular guy join his lover in the vault. And so there's a little bit of truth back here into the story, and here goes. The main character, by the way, who has died, his name is Billy. I forgot what his name is. Well, it appears later. The funeral home was crowded when we got there, but we went to the back anyway, as if we were there to make a routine pickup. I asked Rasmus Onderdonk, he's the driver, one more time about the game plan. He just mumbled that we would have to wing it and use our wits and stay on our toes and play it by ear. He winked as he said these things because he knew they were American cliches. As he would say, they tickled him. I thought it was a mistake to park where we did. To me, an ice cream truck sitting in the back lot of a funeral home creates an interesting visual that people might not forget when queried by police. I thought I saw a worried look on Raz's face, but evidently he was thinking about something else. You're right about parking here, he said. These people might get in the truck and steal the ice cream in the bin. It isn't locked. You think funeral goers would steal some ice cream? I asked. It sounded a little far-fetched to me. This is New Orleans, he said. People here would steal Jesus off the cross and then go back for the nails. The ice cream truck stayed where it was. It was close to the back door, and that was probably how we'd be taking Billy out. So they're stealing a body. We went in as quietly as we could. We'd both been to the funeral home on numerous occasions, bidding farewell to friends who'd gone on to join the great majority. People were arriving and trying to determine which service they needed to join. A petite chestnut-colored woman in a conservative black velvet dress was guiding people to the appropriate chapel. Shalonda, Raz exclaimed. He cut through the crowd and made his way to her side. They began an animated conversation, but it didn't last long, maybe 90 seconds, not even time enough for me to get in line to sign either of the guest books. He came back with a haggard look on his face. Shalonda says they're really busy right now, he said. making it sound as if he'd known her his whole life. She's working the front door, and there are 2 people each attending to the funeral services. They're stretched thin. He smirked, and it was impossible to miss the neurons clicking. When the staff was in front, we'd be performing grand theft in the back. Wait here just a sec, Raz said. I've got to go talk to a man about a dog. He winked. I stood out in the hallway, watching mourners pass by, some teary-eyed, most stony-faced and grim, or at least acting that way. Dread swept over me. Up to now, it was just a game, this body snatching thing, but things were about to change. We were on the verge of committing a serious crime, the kind that generates national headlines and long prison sentences, unless we got one of the wackier local judges. Ready to go? A voice behind me asked. It was Raz. Sure, I said. Was this a reconnaissance trip? I thought we were going to collect somebody. Mission accomplished, Raz said. He's waiting for us in the truck. I thought you were going to the bathroom, I said, as we scurried out the back door towards the truck. I did that too, Raz said. He had a huge grin on his face. I've been busy. I didn't realize where Billy was until I climbed into the truck. I took another step and looked down to the cooler. A few snow crystals had fallen into his hair, but there he was where the bomb pops and ice cream sandwiches had been just a couple of hours ago. Billy Monroe. There are many misconceptions about rigor mortis. It's true that the body begins to stiffen 3 to 6 hours after death, and the rigid state, in which the body is completely stiff, can last another 18 hours. Eventually, the muscles lose their tightness and the body returns to a flaccid state. That's how Billy was. His body was loose and relaxed. He looked as if he were asleep, except that he was a little cold from staying in a funeral cooler for 2 weeks. Billy had been a handsome man, and he was frequently told that he looked like Jackson Browne. He had long golden brown hair that was parted in the middle and went down past his collar. His body was as lean and stringy as his hair. He was not a big guy, maybe 5'7", but he had a cocky, self-assured walk. He was a spectacular eye roller behind one's back and had an inventive foul mouth. People were drawn to him because he was easy to be with. He didn't look down on anyone. I liked him the moment I saw him. Bella had introduced us in those confusing days after I'd left my job at Tulane and begun working at Skylark. I'd never worked in a restaurant before, and he'd probably been in his 5th or 6th stint there. He was taking time off from an oil rig in the Gulf, but couldn't sit still, so he was waiting tables and bartending too. Billy was charged with my tutelage. I had to follow him around and watch everything he did, and he would explain why he was doing what he did, sometimes on the spot, sometimes later. How to present a menu, how to uncork and pour a bottle of wine, how to push certain foods when there was a surplus in the kitchen, how to explain the foods that were in season. He had a certain style, friendly but authoritative. On the last night we trained together, Billy announced that we were going to do something new and special since I was going to be graduating from him and would be working on my own. We were going to play a game called Putting the Pig Back Together Again. It works best on the tourists, he said, without explaining anything to the diners. You try to get them to order soup, salad, entree, and dessert, all containing pork. Dessert, I asked, we have a dessert with pork in it? We do now, he said, a grin splayed across his face. The entrees were the easiest, pork chops, tenderloins, and ham steaks. For soups, there was gumbo that contained ham, but sometimes there was ham and split pea soup or lentil soup with ham in it. Salads were tougher. Occasionally, the menu had a peach and ham salad in the summertime and ham and mandarin oranges at other times. The toughest sell of all was dessert. The restaurant offered a cheese plate, which included salami and hog's head cheese, but people were nervous when they were told it was something made from the brains of a pig. They don't know what head cheese is, Billy said. You have to explain it. Those are the rules of the game. You have to mention the pork. Billy connived with some of the cooks, and they came up with a dessert, something new and creative. They found a supplier who had a cousin whose wife had been making something a little quirky, maple bacon ice cream. She made it for herself, but was willing to make some for the restaurant. Bella was intrigued, and she said okay to the scheme. It flew out the door. Later, they added freshly baked peanut butter and bacon cookies to the maple bacon ice cream and jacked up the price so that it was as expensive as some of the entrees. Those flew out the door too. If Billy wasn't golden before, he was after that. We have a very special dessert tonight that you probably never had before, Billy explained to a couple of diners at table right. Maple bacon ice cream made right here on the premises. The last part wasn't exactly true, but it didn't matter to the customers. They were either appalled or curious. You may not have an opportunity like this ever again, he said. Give it a shot. Live life on the edge. He'd wink and walk away, giving the party time to decide. He made it sound dangerous and enticing. Now here he sat in a cooler devoid of any ice cream. I wanted to touch him. I wanted to undo his white shirt and look at the bullet that had left a hole in his chest. Mostly, I just wanted to hold him and thank him for what he had taught me, but there was no time.
Thank you, Chris. Our next reader, I'm gonna go back to about 2009, I think. That I was fortunate enough to be a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in Gay Mystery that year. And that year, my competitors were some great friends. Josh Tervis, Greg Heron, Michael Thomas Ford, and Fifth Guy. We never knew who the other guy was, so we just called him Fifth Guy. But Mike is has been a good friend from before that and since then, and I'm so glad he's joining us remotely today from Ohio. I also just realized, Mike, or not just realized, but I realized very recently that you are now a municipal official in your village in Ohio. So I'm sure you're keeping that place interesting, and that's a good thing. All right, but back to his bio. When Mike moved to New York in the summer of 1989, he lived a few blocks from here. And he volunteered for several years on the membership committee here at the center. He's pleased to be making his virtual return from rural Southeast Ohio, which is exactly not like the village. His most recent book is the YA novel, Every Star That Falls, which is 15 years in the making, which is a 15 years in the making sequel to his famed novel, Suicide Notes. He's not going to be reading, he is going to be reading, I'm sorry, from his short story, Wishbone, which is included in a recent anthology, Unspeakable Horror 3, Dark Rainbow Rising, and is based on his personal story of being a teenage gay boy fearing he wouldn't survive the AIDS crisis. Michael Thomas Ford.
Hi, New York. This is kind of surreal because I can't see anybody and I can't really see myself.
Change that.
We're being turned around.
There you go.
Hey, there are people. This is very surreal. The center was one of the first places I went to. The Monster was the first place I went to. And I wasn't even 21 at the time, which will tell you something. But the center was probably the second, and a different light when it was on Hudson Street. So this is back then, I didn't think that 30 years later, I'd be living in rural Ohio and looking at people on the internet, reading from my new YA novel. It's all very strange and kind of fantastic. It's funny, as Rob said, we were up for the Lammy for Gay Men's Mystery a long time ago, and time goes very, very quickly. The new book I have out is a sequel to a book that came out the year before that all happened, and I don't know where it all went. It goes very fast. And going back even farther into the past, my story Wishbone is set in 1985, and in 1985 I was about to turn 17. And I remember my father got Newsweek magazine, and probably the year or so before, there was a story about this disease called GRID that was affecting gay men. And I read about this and immediately thought, well, I'm going to die. And then I moved to New York when I was 20, and everybody was dying. And it was a very strange time to be coming out as a gay man and coming out sexually. I didn't think I'd ever be 55, which I turned the other day. And I see some faces in the crowd that are about the same age. And I think a lot of us felt that way. So when Vince Liagano asked me to write a story, I immediately remembered being 16 and 17 and thinking, well, there's this thing that's going to kill me because I'm a gay person. And I wanted to write about that. So I did. And I have to take my glasses off because now that I'm 55, I can't see anything. So the story is called Wishbone, and it's set at Thanksgiving in 1985. And it is about that peculiar combination of being an incredibly horny, sexually curious teenager, terrified of what that means for those of us who were that age back then. I always knew he was a fag. Like how you did. Casey's grandmother said to her husband as she passed him the bowl of mashed potatoes, "You loved him in Macmillan and Wife. In fact, you said you wanted to be him." Casey's grandfather snorted. "Maybe if you looked like Susan St. James," he said. "It's such a pity," Casey's mother remarked. "He was so handsome. In the last picture I saw of him, he was practically a skeleton." Casey poked at the turkey on his plate and said nothing. "Who are you talking about?" his little brother Alex asked. "Rock Hudson," Casey's mother said. "He was a popular actor." "What happened to him?" said Alex, his mouth full of corn casserole. "He died," Casey's mother answered. "He got AIDS," Casey's grandfather said. "What's AIDS?" Alex asked. "It's what fags get when they—" "Harold," Casey's grandmother said, cutting her husband off. "He's 8. And anyway, this isn't Thanksgiving dinner conversation." "You're the one who brought it up," Harold reminded her. "Casey, have you decided where to apply to school?" Casey's grandmother asked. "Not yet," Casey answered. "I'm still thinking about it." This was not true. He had been thinking about it for a long time, and he had already sent off 3 applications, all to schools as far as he could get from Southeast Ohio. Schools in big cities. He thought he had a good chance of getting in. His grades were excellent. He'd played baseball and joined the school newspaper to make himself appear well-rounded. His family wanted him to go to the local state school. He could live at home, they pointed out, save money. Why go anywhere else when there was something nearby, something familiar, something safe? "Don't know why you want to go to school anyway," his grandfather said. "You can come work for your dad and me. People always need electricians. In a year, you'd be making more than those guys spending 4 years in classrooms. It's honest work, too." "I know it is," Casey said. "Maybe I will. And since you're called Sparky and Dad is Sparky Jr., everyone will call me something like Sparkplug," he thought. He knew his family only wanted what was best for him, at least what they thought was best for him. If he let them plan his future, he'd be married by 20, have a couple of kids by 25, and then spend the next 50 years living the same day over and over and over until he died. He had other ideas about his future. The problem was he wasn't sure how to get what he did want, especially now. He didn't really know who Rock Hudson was, but he'd heard a lot about him in the almost 2 months since his death, and what he knew was that Hudson was now the most famous person to die from AIDS, and the first person that a lot of people knew personally to die from it, at least as much as you can know someone you've only seen in the movies or on TV. He knew only slightly more about AIDS than he did about Rock Hudson. He was still not entirely clear on the details, and a lot of what he read in the papers was confusing or contradicted other things he read. But he knew that it seemed to be affecting gay men more than anyone else, and that they were getting it from having sex with each other. Casey wasn't having sex with anyone except himself, but he wanted to, and he wanted it to be with other guys. Now, though, he was afraid that doing anything with another guy would kill him. He'd seen the photographs of men who had AIDS. He'd seen the ugly lesions, the sunken faces, the haunted eyes. And now, whenever he thought about having sex, he saw himself looking like that too. "Casey, what?" He looked up and saw his mother watching him. "I asked if you could drive some pie over to Mr. Gresham's house when you're done." "Oh," Casey said, "sure." I invited Luther for Thanksgiving dinner, his mother announced to the table, but he said he was fine. She sighed. He's gone downhill since Roberta died, barely sees anyone. Least I can do is send some pie over. Everyone agreed that Luther was most certainly not doing well, then returned to whatever it was they were talking about. Casey finished his plate and carried it to the kitchen. His grandmother and mother joined him, slicing up the pies and putting a piece each of pumpkin, mincemeat, and chocolate cream on a paper plate and covering it loosely with foil. Set it on the floor, not on the seat, so it doesn't slide off, his mother instructed as Casey took his Letterman jacket from the hook by the back door, put it on. And tell Luther we all missed him. I will, Casey promised. He went outside and got into the beat-up 72 Ford F-100 pickup that had been his present from his parents on his 16th birthday, in which he and his father had worked on together to get running more or less consistently. He waited a few minutes for the heater to start blowing warm air, then pulled out of the driveway. 20 minutes later, he arrived at the Gresham house, where he knocked on the door and waited for old Luther to answer. Mom and Grandma sent some pie over, Casey said, holding out the plate. Missy Durham and Sarah Branch, he added, when Luther didn't seem to know who he meant. Sure, Luther said, taking the plate. Tell them thanks. He shut the door, which Casey stared at for a moment before turning and going back to the truck. He drove home through the gathering gloom, not particularly anxious to get back to the house. His grandparents would still be there, his grandmother helping with the cleaning up, and his grandfather and father sitting in the living room, watching the Cowboys-Cardinals game and shouting at the television. He loved them all, despite their narrow views of what his life ought to be. But sometimes it was exhausting being around them and the weight of their expectations. At the end of the road, instead of turning right, he turned left and drove west toward Columbus. The city sat like Oz at the end of Route 33. He knew there were bars there, where guys like him got together. Sometimes he thought about going. There were kids at school who went drinking in the city. They said they almost never got carded. Maybe, someday, he would go there and find out for himself. For now, he drove until he came to the first rest area. There he pulled off and into the parking lot, taking one of the spots at the very end, away from the sallow glare of the sodium vapor lights. He left the truck running for warmth, but turned the headlights off. The restrooms themselves were set back from the lot with a concrete pathway leading to them. The women's room was on the left and the men's on the right. There were two other cars, both parked closer to the center of the lot. One had someone sitting in the passenger seat. The other was empty. A moment later, a man exited the restroom and walked to the empty car, got in and pulled away. Not long after, a woman emerged from the other side of the building and got into the remaining car. Now alone in the lot, Casey asked himself what he was doing there. He asked himself the same question every time he found himself at the rest area, which over the past 8 months or so had been perhaps half a dozen times. The first was after Kevin Dreyfus at school had mentioned that a fairy had offered to suck his dick while he was taking a piss there. According to Kevin, he in return had offered to knock the fairy's teeth in and gotten out of there as fast as he could. A couple of weeks later, Casey found himself in the parking lot for the first time. He sat in his truck for a couple of hours, watching men go in and out of the little concrete block building. Most were in there for only a few minutes, but some stayed far longer than necessary to do what they needed to do in there. When this happened, Casey found himself itching to go inside and see what they were doing. He kept telling himself that he would get out of the truck if the person or persons in question remained inside for just one more minute, then one more, then another, until inevitably they did emerge and the opportunity was lost. He had no idea of knowing what exactly happened inside the restroom, but the thought that something had both aroused and terrified him. He longed to find out for himself, but so far he had done nothing more than watch from the safety of the parking lot. After that first time, he found himself returning a few weeks later. Again, he sat in the truck and watched as men came and went. Again, he didn't join them. It was on his third or maybe fourth visit that he recognized one of the faces from a previous time. The man could have been one of his father's friends or one of his friend's fathers, an ordinary man, handsome in an everyday way, but not what most would call unusually striking or even memorable. And yet, Casey did remember him. He watched the man enter the bathroom. He checked the time on his watch. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At 15 minutes, Casey put his hand on the handle of the truck door, but found he couldn't bring himself to open it. At 20 minutes, another man disappeared inside the restroom. 10 minutes later, the second man exited, followed a few minutes later by the first man. That night, Casey had jerked off right there in his truck, hidden in the shadows. He jerked off thinking about what the two men might have done together, what he might have done with one or both of them had he been brave enough to open the truck door and go join them. He'd come hard, groaning, spraying his load onto his belly. Afterward, he'd cleaned up with a handful of Dairy Queen napkins, shoving the ball of soiled paper back into the glove box and slamming the door shut. Thinking about that night now, as he again sat in the lot and wondered what happened inside the men's room, filled him with a peculiar mix of shame and desire. He stiffened inside his jeans and rubbed himself while he stared out the windshield at the empty sidewalk. There were no cars there now. It would be safe to get out of the truck, venture into the restroom, see what it was like in there. Then, if nothing else, he would have an image to use when he was alone in his bedroom later, the door locked and his parents fast asleep downstairs. He was opening the door when the shadows around the restroom door shifted and someone appeared. Casey stopped, confused. No car had pulled into the rest area. It was still empty. Yet there was someone standing beneath the harsh light over the door to the men's room. It was definitely a man, but where had he come from? The man turned and looked in the direction of Casey's truck. For a moment, very briefly, it seemed his eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. But that was probably just the light reflecting off glasses, that was all. Still, Casey found himself holding his breath until the man turned away and walked into the restroom. Casey had an overwhelming desire to follow him. Again, he reached for the handle of the door. As his fingers touched it, the truck's radio blared to life. "We built this city on rock and roll." Startled, Casey pulled his hand away. "#1 for the second week in a row," a DJ's voice said as the song faded away. "And I know most of you are still digesting your pumpkin pie, but the big daddy of the holiday season is just around the corner. So let's make things merry and bright with last year's biggest musical gift, Band-Aids Do They Know It's Christmas." Casey turned the knob on the dash as the familiar drum beat began, silencing the noise. He put the truck in reverse and pulled out of the spot, suddenly anxious to get away. Only when he was back on the highway, headed for home, did he turn the headlights back on, as if doing it any earlier would have brought unwanted attention. And if you want to find out what happens when Casey does go into the men's room, Unspeakable Horror 3, Dark Rainbow Rising, edited by Vince Liagano.
Thank you, Mike. And I should have mentioned when we were in competition for that Lammy for best game history, Mike won. So I actually left afterwards, and for the first time I met, now deceased, the legendary Richard Labonte, who was coordinating judging for Lambda that year in the lobby, and I introduced myself. And he just kind of gave me that kind of, it wasn't your year. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Me, Mike, Greg, Josh had the most fun competition going on online. We won. We all won. Not fifth guy. And I should have mentioned, yes, Vince Liagano, who is a Facebook friend. I don't know why I skipped right over his name, but if he's watching, good job, Vince. And our next reader will be Ellen. Make sure now you got me paranoid, Ellen. Called him Ellenzweig before. Ellen Ellenzweig, who has published arts criticism and commentary in numerous publications, including Art in America, American Photographer, and The Village Voice. For 2 decades, he's written regularly for the Gay and Lesbian Review, contributing reviews on films, books, and theater, as well as longer pieces of cultural commentary. In 1992, he published a landmark illustrated study, The Homoerotic Photograph, with Columbia University Press. His most recent book is George Platt Lyon's The Daring Eye, a biography of the gay mid-century American photographer, published in late 2021 by Oxford University Press. He's also published a few works of short fiction in print and online, including a short story included in the Plume collection, Men on Men 7, That's New Gay Fiction, and another in the anthology Kosher Meat, subtle, edited by Larry Schimmel. Alan.
First, I want to thank Rob for organizing this. He did a similar series back in the spring and invited me to participate then. And I don't think, well, unless you're a writer, you may not know how encouraging it is to be invited to read to people, because writing is a pretty lonely activity. And so to be able to participate, to see people, even if the response is kind of a hazy, it's still meaningful to be able to engage with readers in this way. So anyway, I'm going to read from an unpublished novel called The French Professor, which takes place in 1987. I don't know why the 1980s seems to be a decade for this evening so far. In any case, I won't tell you anything more because this is the very first chapter. The sun darted through the trees onto the gravel terrace and linen tablecloths of 7th Avenue, a charming and hidden away restaurant in the 7th arrondissement, Paris. Professor Luc Aubry sat with his wife over the last of their meal, which was to be the last of their meals together in Paris for the coming 15 weeks. The two were leaving the next day for the United States, Boston to be exact, where on the outskirts of that Athens of New England, Professor Aubry was to teach a course at a small but distinguished university of the kind that is the pride of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. To the few Americans seated in the restaurant, Professor Aubry and his wife appeared to be what is usually called, with a mix of envy and awe, typical Parisians. They were a couple of extreme elegance in dress and grooming, he with a navy blue blazer and pale blue shirt, she in a rust-colored, perfectly tailored suit, whose tight skirt was slightly slit, permitting a view of excellent calves. Aubry was an unusually handsome man, shockingly so, and from strangers on the street, he was often greeted with a momentary look of recognition, as if he were a French movie star or television personality. If his wife was not a great beauty, she was something equally admired in the capital city. A woman of such evident sophistication and chic that her almost too forceful, somewhat masculine face was not an obstacle, but an exclamation point upon the drama of her effect. With his longish hair swept aside off his forehead to show off ice blue eyes, and with her auburn hair cut just so at a cost of considerable francs, they were a pair to give credit to the claim that the French know something the rest of the world doesn't. What those not native to Paris might never have guessed was the depth of purpose and sobriety in their professional lives. Madame Jacqueline Aubry did not go by this name, but rather by her own family's. At the renowned Pasteur Institute, she was called and only identified as Jacqueline Monge, and had worked there for 20 years researching that class of microbiological warrior known as the human retrovirus. She was of the team that had discovered HIV, a cause of the autoimmune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. For his part, Luc Aubry was one of a few French scholars whose entire career had been spent researching in its every phase and manifestation that national crisis of French Republican values, just before the turn of the previous century, known as the Dreyfus Affair. He had written a half dozen major volumes, which joined the swelling ranks of expert analysis that documented, dissected, and explained how a modest Alsatian Jew, a captain in the French military, had been plucked from obscurity, branded a traitor, his very name made venomous, and thereby set in motion a wrenching period in modern French history, where every French man and woman was forced to take sides for or against le Capitaine Alfred Dreyfus. Aubry and Jacqueline were capping their meal, each with a double espresso, a caffeine coda, to a leisurely sun-drenched luncheon, when Aubry noticed a slight verbal altercation brewing between a waiter and a pair of diners a few tables away. "What's going on there?" Jacqueline looked at her husband as she lit her cigarette. Years in medical research had not swayed her from love affair with tobacco. "I'm not sure. I think they think the check is incorrectly computed. They're Americans. I heard them talking before. I'm sure they think it's a French plot." Jacqueline smiled. Luc made such jokes with irony and affection. They were hardly strangers to America and its customs, having met at Columbia in the late 60s when they were both doing a year's study abroad. Their professional lives had given them many occasions to travel to the States. Over more than 20 years, they had established American friendships and professional contacts and felt as easy in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, or Boston as in any city of France. But they also knew the depth of misunderstanding that could overflow the shores of a shared ocean. Aubry and Jacqueline strained to listen to the argument. The American man and woman were repeatedly pointing to their check and to their plates while proceeding in an unsuccessful mix of unpracticed French and desperate lapses into English. The waiter, in his turn, was at a loss to satisfy the American couple, with his accented English made haughty by being uttered in the spotlight of a space where his every maneuver and declaration was available to public view. "Should I intercede, do you think?" Aubry looked to Jacqueline. He was fully bilingual, spoke an uncannily colloquial American, and might at least allow the parties involved to appreciate where the problem resided. "I think not," said Jacqueline. "You'll be shot at from both sides. Besides, you wouldn't want to spoil the French reputation for arrogance by being both nosy and helpful." Ah, well. She stood up and smoothed her tight, sexy skirt. "Tomorrow, America. Vive la France!" Evan Kendall was reading the course description for the Dreyfus Affair, Intellectual Engagement During the Fin de Siècle. He stood absently in the middle of the French department's reception area, creating an obstacle around which others had to pass. He had registered for the course back in the spring, an elective which might as well have been exchanged for something less taxing. But Professor Luc Aubry was known to be a draw, but should not be passed up. As French graduate students were overwhelmingly female, there was often the suspicion that what his previous students recommended was as much the opportunity to gaze upon Luc Aubry's person as to connect with one of the finest minds of the post-war generation of French social historians. Evan, however, had taken his cue from Eleanor Ashford, the administrative secretary of the department, who said to him in no uncertain terms, "He's simply the best visiting professor we've ever had. Incredibly well-read. His English, if you can believe it, is nearly as beautiful as his French. He's been back and back, time and again. Oh, and Evan, he's balm for the eyeballs." Eleanor and Evan had passed the point of mincing words. One day early in their acquaintance, he had referred to himself as the queen of the francophone fairies, and had so astonished and delighted her with his self-deprecation that she had swiftly made him her one student confidant, a position of some distinction, since she usually found the minority of males in the department studious bores, and the females intensely competitive and self-involved. Now he was standing not 10 feet from her desk, heedless of the odd pose he had adopted as he read Aubry's course syllabus as if for the first time. "Do you realize how many books he has on his reading list?" Evan seemed to ask the question to thin air. "Are you addressing me?" Eleanor said as she tucked a file into her desk drawer. She looked up from her task without quite lifting her head, just rolling her eyes. Evan was often a figure of fun within the department, educated at the best private schools, full of himself, with an English accent from no one knew where. He had nevertheless settled in at Cross University when he might have well distinguished himself at one of the Ivy Leagues. But he had admitted to his intimates that he would rather be a large fish in a celebrated little pond. And if Cross were not Harvard or Yale, it still had a unique doctoral program in international relations that boasted as alumni 2 undersecretaries of state and 1 US ambassador to the United Nations. Evan was fixed upon a career as some kind of international power broker, despite, as Eleanor said, clear evidence of a big mouth, a loose cock, and a renegade asshole. Just look at this. He has here 25 books on the list. Cinq années de ma vie by Alfred Dreyfus. No one needs to read what Dreyfus himself has to say. 5 years of his life. It would take 5 years to read that sorry account. Good God, the whole irony of the affair was how Dreyfus himself got lost in it. He was a pathetic gnat at the center of a fucking national calamity with the military and the nationalists and the monarchists and the church, all anti-Semites on one side, and on the other, the intellectuals fighting for Republican verities like disinterested justice and the rule of law. And in the middle of all of this, the poor son of a bitch comes back from Devil's Island and he's practically an embarrassment to his own cause. Why? Because the man can barely speak. He's so hoarse and so weakened by his frightful incarceration in equatorial heat, with his feet chained to the bed at night and a diet no Frenchman should serve another. But of course, they thought he wasn't a real Frenchman, only a dirty Jew who'd given up secrets to the fucking Germans who had not so long before, during the Franco-Prussian War, chased the frogs out of Alsace, disgracing French amour propre for at least a generation. But we don't have to read Dreyfus's commentary to understand the damned affair. Dreyfus didn't understand the damned affair, and it was named after him. Eleanor took a beat. Are you quite through? Evan took a beat. Yes. So, do you want to drop the course? Are you kidding? Of course I'm not going to drop the course. Has he arrived yet? No, they arrive tomorrow. They? Yes, his wife's accompanying him. She'll be here just the first 10 days. You are a font of information, Ellie. Do tell. I have no use for the wife, but let's hear it. Just then the phone rang and Eleanor was forced to deal with department business. She took a message from her boss, Professor Agnes Chambers, chair of the department, but all the while watched Evan tapping his right hand to his side as if he were being kept waiting and had by rights first dibs on her time. Evan was a notorious thorn in the side of several departments, but he also cared passionately about his coursework, read quantities, commented in full, and wrote with confidence and erudition. He would as soon state an original theory, even if it were wrong, than simply spout the party line. He was better liked by professors than by his fellow graduate students, though he had formed his own close circle of loyals. Perhaps most disturbing about him was the way he waved the flag of his sexual persona. It threw some people the way he marched into class one week with half his head shaved, the other half bleached platinum, or the way he leisurely strolled campus in spring with his biceps bulging out of tank tops and tight t-shirts, while he displayed individual fingernails painted in shimmery shades of coral and taupe. At first blush, naturally, people thought him effeminate. But when he began to speak with a rich, deep bass and the convictions of a backbencher in Parliament, those who might be his obvious opponents took his measure more guardedly and with respect. He might chance to look foolish, but he was nobody's fool.
So good, Ellen. Thank you. Yeah, it's 80s night, right? Move back into this century. Okay, every time I just keep thinking then back to Mike Ford saying he just turned 55. I'm like, poor baby. You're almost at Mike, if you're still on, you're almost to the age where you need to take like a leave every morning just to, get your coffee. So our next reader is Robin Geigel. She is joining us from the Jersey Shore. She's an author, attorney, and advocate. Her novel Survivor's Guilt was recent, and this is like, I just learned this like yesterday. This is amazing. Her novel Survivor's Guilt was recently selected by Time Magazine as one of the 100 best mystery and thriller books of all times. Right? Which is there's no surprise then. She was the winner of the Publishing Triangle of Joseph Hansen Award, our first one last year. And thank you, Michael Nava, for the inspiration and for funding that award. For the Joseph Hansen Award for LGBTQ plus crime writing, which we introduced again last year. In addition to Survivor's Guilt, Robin has 2 other novels out. Her debut, By Way of Sorrow, which was called Quietly Groundbreaking by the New York Times, and Remain Silent, which was published in May 2023. The main character in each of her books is a New Jersey criminal defense lawyer, Erin McCabe. Erin is brave, smart, funny, and transgender. Take it away, Robin Geigel.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for that beautiful introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and it was such a thrill to win the Joseph Hansen Award last year. So as Rob just said, Survivor's Guilt, there it is. It is the second of the Erin McCabe series. And as Rob also said, Erin is an attorney. She's tenacious, resourceful, representing criminal defense people. She's in her 30s and she practices law with her partner, Dwayne Swisher, who is a former FBI agent and a Black man. And the story, although it's book 2 in the series so far, there will be a book 4. I'm happy to announce Kensington accepted the manuscript for book 4, which will be published in June. Although it's the second in the series, it is written as a standalone. And as Rob also said, we're back into the 21st century. The time frame for the book is 2008, 2009. And the story opens with Erin and Dwayne, Erin on trial representing a defendant by the name of Justin Mackey in a gambling case dealing with offshore gambling. During the trial, Justin meets with Erin at 4:00 in the morning and tells her that he's in trouble and he's jumping bail. And shortly thereafter, he winds up executed. Shortly thereafter, Charles Parsons, a very rich businessman, is found dead as well. And his daughter, Ann Parsons, later admits to killing him and pleads guilty to murder. However, a homicide detective who's working the case, Ed Kluska, thinks something's off. And so he's not convinced that she's really guilty. And so what I'm going to read from is chapter 9 of Survivor's Guilt, where Erin and Ed Kluska meet to discuss what's going on. Kluska had asked to meet at 2:30 p.m. 30 minutes later, Erin was beginning to wonder how much longer she should wait when she saw him walk in. He stood by the front of the bar, temporarily blinded by the shift from bright sunlight to the bar's dim interior. Then, after about 20 seconds, he started walking towards her. Looked like he had put on a few pounds, maybe more than a few, but he was still a hard guy to forget. He dropped onto the bench on the opposite side, causing the entire booth to shudder, putting a file folder on the table in front of him. Wasn't sure you'd recognize me. It's been a few years, Erin said, a grin spreading across her face. Jesus Christ, McCabe, I'm a fucking detective. You don't think I know how to go to your fucking website to find your picture? Honestly, Ed, I just figured you got lucky and figured the two guys at the bar were too big to be little old me. Kleska's mouth twisted. You may be a skirt now, but that doesn't mean I won't call you an asshole. Thanks, Ed. Good to see you too. A waitress sauntered over out of the kitchen. You want something to drink? She asked. Club with lime, he replied. Menus, she asked. Not for me, Aaron replied. Nah, he said. They do have a pretty good bar pie, he said after she walked away, if you're hungry. She looked at him and shook her head. Sounds like you've been here before. Back in the day, when I was playing softball and still drinking, this was a regular post-game watering hole. But I haven't had a drink in 10 years and haven't played softball in about 8, so not for a while. Figured no one would recognize me this time of day. Besides, had to take it out of county, but not too far in case I needed to get back in a hurry. Woodbridge was perfect. Sounds mysterious, she said, as the waitress slid the drinks onto the table. Kleska took a swig from his club soda. Look, McCabe, I'll explain everything, but first I need a guarantee from you. Of course. You and I were always on opposite sides, but I always thought you were a good detective. If you're in some kind of trouble, just say so, and this will be a privileged conversation. He snorted. Nothing that easy. I need it to be beyond privileged. I need it to be that this meeting never happened. She gave him a quizzical look. Meeting him was one thing. Lying about it was another. Ed, humor me, he interrupted. It could be my job. Okay, she replied, both troubled and intrigued. But if I don't like where this is going, I'm out of here. He pointed at the manila folder on the table. You hear about a murder in Westfield about 5 months ago? Guy by the name of Charles Parsons. She nodded. Sure, his daughter pled guilty last week, right? Ann Parsons. She took a plea to aggravated manslaughter. Under the deal, she'll get a flat 20 with an 80% parole disqualifier. So minimum of 17, maxes out at 20. She gets sentenced in 4 weeks. Flat 20 doesn't sound like a bad deal. How old is she, Aaron asked. 25, I think, Kleska replied. So she gets in her mid-40s. She has a second chance of life. So what's going on, Ed? Why are we here? Kleska downed his club soda and stroked his beard. I don't think she did it, he said flatly. There's something off here, and I can't figure it out. Erin's face scrunched, her eyes narrowing. Ed, you're the detective. Isn't that your job, to figure it out? You ever deal with Tom Willis? Erin was trying to keep up with the conversation. Yeah, I tried 2 murder cases against him back when I was in the PD's office. What'd you think of him? Honestly? Yeah. Arrogant asshole, she said. He hasn't changed. I told him before we arrested Parsons, there were pieces that didn't fit. But he's convinced we got the right person. Or he just doesn't give a shit because he's basically a lazy fuck. And if his piece of the puzzle doesn't fit, he'll just throw it away. Don't sugarcoat it, Ed. Tell me how you really feel. He gave her a dirty look. As far as Willis is concerned, she's pled guilty, case closed. Well, to be fair, Ed, that's usually the way it works, isn't it? You don't technically keep investigating a case after someone pleads guilty, she said. Don't be a smartass, he fired back with a scowl. I don't know why she pled guilty, but I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've learned to trust my gut. And my gut is screaming that she didn't do it. I want you to help her. She leaned forward, trying to gauge his motives. Ed, clearly this is important to you, but what am I missing? If you're so convinced she's not guilty, why aren't you having this conversation with her attorneys? I have my doubts about whose side they're on. She's represented by a couple of lawyers for Winston Draper, hired by the executrix of her father's estate. I don't know anyone there, but they're all supposed to be top-notch lawyers, she'd offered. Maybe, but they didn't do shit in this case. They got discovery, and a couple months later, they pled her guilty. No motions, no nothing. So why me? She asked. It's not like you and I had a lot of cases together, and the ones we did, my clients were convicted. Kleska's eyes flashed. To start with, when I knew you as a PD, I always thought you were a decent attorney. Granted, you were brand spanking new, but you had a presence in the courtroom that you can't teach. And I followed that case that you had down last year in Ocean County. From what I read, you and your partner had to put up with some crazy bullshit. But the main reason? He stopped, his intense look replaced by something almost sheepish. Look, don't take this the wrong way, but you've got more balls than a lot of attorneys. You know, just to do what you did, he said, motioning to Erin with his hands. That took a lot of guts. Parsons needs someone she can trust, someone who will understand her, someone who's walked in her shoes. Erin was now totally confused. Ed, what the hell are you talking about? And Parsons is transgendered, he said, as if throwing down a gauntlet. What? You heard me. She's just like you. Isn't that what you are? Transgendered? She shook her head. It's transgender, an adjective. I'm a transgender woman, not transgendered. Whatever. She was born a guy like you. Erin closed her eyes and made a decision not to get into a debate on Kleska's current terminology. I don't remember anything in the papers about her being trans. There hasn't been anything. No one found out until after her plea, and she was remanded to the Union County Jail to await sentencing. From what I'm told, her medical exam determined she was born a guy. Okay, assuming she's a transgender woman, I don't see how that plays into why you think I can help. Kleska looked exasperated. Don't go stupid on me now. There isn't another fucking lawyer in this state that will understand her the way you can. She needs someone she can trust. And who better than you? You're making a lot of assumptions here, Ed. One, she wants help. Two, that she doesn't or can't trust her current lawyers. And three, even if I wanted to help her, there's something that I can do for her. There's also the small detail that she's already has counsel. It's not like I can just walk into the Union County Jail and tell her I want to represent her. Listen, you find a quasi-legitimate reason to see her, and I'll get you on the visitors list. When you have a reason, text me, the number I text you from. He slid the file across the table, then downed his second club soda. Take this, read it carefully. And McCabe, I've never done anything remotely like this in my career. This blows up and my career is over. But I've never had a case where there's something so rotten, the stench is making me sick. Why are you so sure, Ed? There's a recording of the murder. I've listened to it, I don't know, maybe 100 times. He stood up. I'm convinced it's not Ann Parsons on that recording. So was the detective who found the recording. She wanted to do a voice analysis comparison, but Willis said no. He looked down at Erin and raised an eyebrow. 20 years is a long fucking time, McCabe. Think about it. You're her only hope.
Amazing. Robin Geigel. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a quick intermission only to tell you of our upcoming, before we lose any audience. I want to tell you about our upcoming, and that's not a knock about the second half of the program. But we have 2 readings that are already scheduled. On Thursday, 5 weeks from today, Thursday, November 16th, we will be back here and we will be joined by Christian Baines, Jim Berg, Mary Burns, J.P. Howard, Michael Klein, Sean Patrick Mulroy, and Mecca Jamila Sullivan. And then on Saturday, a few weeks after that, Saturday, December 2nd at 3 o'clock, we actually hijacked a program that our friend Gerard Cabrera has curated for World AIDS Day. And Gerard will be here at 3 o'clock on Saturday the 2nd, December 2nd, along with Philip, and more, by the way, you'll be hearing more about Gerard in the next week. So watch our social media. But Gerard will be hosting Philip Clark, Reginald Harris, Charles Bryce Gonzalez, and Stephen Rio. So we're excited about these 2 upcoming programs, and we will be announcing soon our early 2024 programs, where we hope to have Michael Thomas Ford in person, Felice Picano in person, and a lot of other exciting stuff going on. Our next reader, though, it's Dale Corvino. But before I get too much into Dale, I got to tell you, Dale is a member of Community Board 4 here in Manhattan, which is I just think we're hearing from 8 readers tonight, and there are probably things that I don't know about some of the other readers. But when I think about Robin Geigel works with Garden State Equality, Michael Thomas Ford in rural southeastern Ohio is on the village board. Dale is here working on community board 4, and I know being a community board member, I've been in enough community board meetings in my life. For those of you in New York, they can be, painful. So to be voluntarily be a member is like a great thing to help the community. So I just think it's great that we have all these writers who are not just putting their words out and inspiring queer readers and the queer community, but they've dug in and they're working just to promote life for the quality of life for everyone. So thank you, Dale. Now your formal introduction. Dale Corvino's essays have appeared in On Salon and On Salon, RFD Magazine, and the Gay and Lesbian Review. His debut collection of short stories, Bonds and Boundaries, is out this month from Rebel Satori Press. And the stories examine those titular themes: queer longing and digital estrangement. So, Dale Corvino.
Hi, everybody. I brought a visual. Hold on. All right, that's my book cover. It started to ship a couple of days ago. You can order from the Bureau. Bonds and Boundaries. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm pretty excited. It's my debut. All right. So what do we got here? I erase this.
Well, yes, except for I don't know how.
That's not it.
Faces or something.
Oh, there it is. All right, great. Okay, so this is a little preview of Bonds and Boundaries. Actually, our full launch is going to be here at the Bureau on November 9th, and I will be in conversation with Michael Bullock. Michael Bullock is the co-editor of this incredible document called The Teenage Diaries of Chandelier, another Gen X figure you should all know. And we're going to talk about the Gen X themes that are brought up in both in my collection and in Chandelier Diaries. Okay, so the stories in Bonds and Boundaries are grouped in 3 sections. The characters in the first section, Beacons, feel the pull between biological and chosen families. The middle section is called Vectors, and that section all features sex workers and sex work situations. Those are very ripe for exploring bonds and boundaries alike. And the third section is called Afterlives. And I'm going to read a story from Afterlives. And as some of the other readers noted, I often feel like I'm living a kind of afterlife. As a Gen Xer, an analog child living in a digital age, somehow getting through AIDS, grief, the pandemic, and now this kind of unraveling that we're in. So this is the opening from Donor Baby. No spoilers, but this is a kind of affirming fantasy. Some context. When I was a broke college student, I learned that gay men were banned, not just from donating blood, but also from donating their little swimmers too. I did anyway, I just lied. That's a kind of fiction as protection. So this is Donor Baby. On the appointed morning, Teddy trimmed his graying beard, put on a button-down shirt, which had grown a bit tight since he'd last worn it, and trudged down to the criminal court building, an imposing Art Deco heap with 4 towers surrounding a central ziggurat. But what was before him filled most New Yorkers with dread. He welcomed the break in his routines and was even a little turned on by the civic spaces. What he hadn't anticipated was the assault on his composure of the morning rush hour subway trip. Chewed up by the legion of elbowing commuter warriors and spit out at City Hall, he gathered himself once inside the paneled courtroom, holding his tall frame upright and pulling in his belly. He sat with a pool of potential jurors opposite the defendant, a handsome young man with red-brown skin and an indifferent air, accused of marijuana possession. No one should be in jail over a plant, he fumed. Despite the young man's baggy clothes, Teddy caught peeks of his sinewy build as he shifted in his chair. He indulged a fleeting fantasy of smoking up and making out with him after convincing the rest of the jury to acquit. The judge addressed the juror pool. You must be completely honest in your answers to the attorneys. Don't hold back any detail, even if it seems irrelevant. Teddy was a little shaken. He was still resolved to lie, but they didn't even bring up his own marijuana use as he'd expected. Instead, he was asked coded questions about civil order and law enforcement. He gave the answers he thought would get him selected. Several potential jurors were dismissed. I'm a semifinalist, he congratulated himself, breathing out, adjusting his imaginary sash. In the next round of questioning, one of the lawyers asked, "Do you have any children?" He wondered about the relevance. Maybe parents would be more authoritarian with suspected drug dealers, or perhaps they'd have empathy for the young defendant. Remembering the judge's admonition, Teddy blurted out, "None that I know of." There was laughter all around the room. Even the defendant hooted. He hadn't meant it as snark. He was just being completely honest. He was dismissed with the next batch of rejects. The lawyer's question had prompted a panicked recall of his stint as a sperm donor. It was an episode he'd pushed out of his conscious mind for years. He was a broke college student, and he'd get $50 a pop at this lab uptown. He couldn't be sure in the spontaneous rush, but he thought maybe they'd made some babies from his donations. Up until that courtroom inquiry, he'd put the whole enterprise out of his head. Now, a surge of impressions hit as he loped away from the judicial ziggurat. Navigating Canal Street, Teddy formed a mental picture of the ad he'd seen. Business card size with large copy reading, "Sperm donors," and in smaller letters, a phone number. It was definitely in print. The internet didn't even exist back then. He was pretty sure it was the Village Voice. That's where you'd find stuff like that. The ad had enticed him with promises of quick and easy money. Beats working, right? Teddy had called the number and answered a series of questions. He was then invited to the lab on Madison Avenue, a location in which Teddy's mind had lent the enterprise some legitimacy. He entered the building's lobby on the appointed day. Polished marble gleamed and brass accents sparkled. The doorman seemed to know where he was headed and indifferently gestured towards a sign that read, "Icehold Laboratories," and pointed down a staircase. The basement, with its bright white walls and greenish fluorescent lighting, was hygienic and pulsed with the audible buzz of mechanical systems. A young nurse handled Teddy's intake, pretty and solid, but fairly stern and humorless. Strictly business, she was not remotely amused by the particulars of her assignment and wore the skeptical scowl of a gatekeeper, looking out for any undesirables who might disturb this holy sanctum of reproductive science. Teddy had been asked a series of questions by Nurse Stern as he came to think of her. She'd marked down his responses on a form. The questions probed his background, general health, interests, and medical history. Then she looked up from her form and narrowed her eyes. Any homosexual inclinations? No. Any activity? None. He'd intuitively known that any positive responses to these questions would have been a deal breaker. Though he dated girls through his junior year, in high school, he'd been seduced by a male classmate late one summer night after taking a midnight dip in someone's pool. Mickey was flamboyantly gay and had propositioned him as they huddled in bath towels. Teddy's wet Speedo bunched down around his ankles and his butt slipped between the plastic straps of the chaise lounge as Mickey gave him his first blowjob. His gay encounters in college had been drunken and furtive, but he was pretty sure by then where they were leading. It had come time to collect Teddy's first deposit. Nurse Stern, who sat on the other side of a lucite wall, just like in a money bank, slid a stack of porn magazines and a little cup through the deal tray. There was an issue of Jugs, a leg show, and one pretty hardcore title on the bottom. Teddy wordlessly pushed the porn back at her, keeping the cup. They glared at each other for a hot minute through the speak hole. Then she pointed towards a small room with a bench and a counter. He'd locked the door, opened his pants, closed his eyes, and willed his imagination to do better than those crumpled magazines. He came up with a pansexual freeze, bodies rolling into one another, a procession of sexually peaking individuals hungry for his touch. It took no time at all, and the main challenge was aiming for the cup. His sample had been rigorously tested. You've got a very high sperm count. Your sample demonstrates excellent motility, the lab assistant enthused. Tell me something I don't know, Teddy crowed. Wait, what is that? Motility measures how active your little swimmers are. You want a high score for fertility treatments. Okay, cool. He recalled signing off on some paperwork, only briefly glancing at the terms. Your samples may be used for either fertilization or research. They'll be frozen. That's why motility is important. Frozen? Initially lured by the promise of easy money, Teddy had suddenly become concerned about the science. There'd be no way for him to be sure how his donations were used. His worry was fleeting though, cash ruled. Once he was officially registered as a donor, he scheduled an appointment right away. He was eager to get the income flowing. Nurse Stern then informed him that he could only donate twice a month. He'd envisioned it becoming his primary income. Instead, it became a supplement to a part-time job at a copy shop. He'd go to the clinic every other week for about 8 months until he couldn't face the disapproving scowl of Nurse Stern once more. She was always there, someone he simply couldn't charm, and she seemed to suspect him. This buried episode surged back into his consciousness as Teddy made his way home through clotted streets. He wrinkled his nose at a loud man ahead of him, bad at sharing the sidewalk. Ugh, this obnoxious suit, can't wait to get home. Locking the door, he shucked his grown-up clothes, sprawled naked on the sofa, and processed. Maybe I really do have children. They'd be grown by now, a whole army. The cat settled on the sofa's arm, purring loudly. And for the conclusion, you'll have to buy Bonds and Boundaries.
Thank you, Dale. Good stuff. Can't wait. Remember, books will be here, correct? They will be available. You can order them here. I gotta do it, sorry, wait, bgsqd.com, correct? Yeah, thanks. I'm like Rain Man in the office every time I have to put your URL in. And don't forget publishingtriangle.org, by the way, and sasfest.org if you want to attend St. Sinners Literary Festival to see some of us in New Orleans in March. Our next reader is a fellow Jersey City resident. So Jersey City's representing today. Jeffrey Bird's poems have appeared in various journals such as Impossible, Archetype, The Leveler, Corn Green, and most recently, Pine Hills Review. He received an MFA from NYU. As I mentioned, he lives in Jersey City in one of the neighborhoods I love to walk through. The Hamilton Park area of Jersey City, by the way, is a beautiful area. So when you do come by, see Jeffrey, you might see me. Anyway, and Jeffrey also regularly reviews films for Film Forward. Jeffrey Berg.
Also, continuing the theme of the 1980s by happenstance. March on Washington, 1979. People on the green as the band plays. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. We are family. You know what I mean? Pins on denim jackets, bell-shaped haircuts, afros, thick beards, double bridge glasses and shades. Balloons rise, mirroring the sun. The most shocking thing are all the smiles I see. For all those who are here, and those who couldn't make it, and those who are afraid to be, perhaps we are on the precipice of something good, being everywhere, being free. And this poem is after the film version of World According to Garp, which stars Robin Williams and John Lithgow as a trans woman. Roberta. I don't see myself as Lithgow's Roberta, but maybe a sort of Roberta, sitting on porch steps on Fisher's Island in espadrilles and a brown paisley caftan, watching the tide under a blue sky almost violet as the sun sets. I am having a beautiful life today. I am not living in the past. I am living in the present, thinking about the past like a nerdy historian burrowing, memoirs penciled in on a legal pad. I swear that when I'm 64 keeps following me around with its wobbly knees and wobbly clarinets ever since the Ouija board told me I'd die at 63. Robin Williams took his life at 63. Paul's voice then could stand in for Robin's, reedy, twinkling, communicating something precisely upsetting. Robin sits on the porch in a wicker chair behind me, this sort of Roberta, and I feel we are caught in a moment like death catching us. He asks about my love life that isn't alive. I think about my Club Med fling. I say things like, it's probably nothing, and maybe things will change to fill the air. I tried to take a good snapshot of the scene with my phone, but it's all moving so fast. He listens compassionately, and then I get up, briefly taking his hand, and we lock eyes. He's always playing the friend, the genial counselor, professor, and the moment slips away into ether, quicker than we want it to. A smile that once felt like twinkling whimsy, now, after his death, feels like wreckage. Our scattered snapshot shatters into pieces of paper across the lawn, on the hill above the sea. In the gale, my caftan billows, and we try to gather each and every page. Purple rain. Be alive now. It could all go up in fog machine fog. Spread out on my brass waterbed with your ass curved like First Avenue danceteria. I feel your heartbeat. I got my stethoscope on. I got my little white bow tie on. Mismatched fabrics. candles round my boombox. I am addicted to food substances. Is it safe to be strange? Is it safe to wear mascara, pompadours, camisoles, lingerie stockings, the ruffles of Amadeus, 4-inch heels and a bustier? Why do we go back to the men who strike us? Maybe I am something you'll never understand, prodded by winky guards marching green-faced in the Wizard of Oz, oh-wee like chants from the Times Jungle Love. I blend in, and maybe eventually I can undress, preserve my own body, escape. We take it down low now, reveal our sweat, disrobing our supreme robes, Scalia's jigger pokery up in fog, and we slow dance in this club to Purple Rain. Here, even we can make the most macho club owner alone, looking on at us in the haze in his Detroit Tigers cap, look as if he is crying behind his white shades with lenses of the faintest hint of lavender. And this last poem is after the John Waters Louis Polyester. Odorama. I am dialing up a way into these fragments on my teal rotary wall phone, Pepsi and cake, putt-putting on squares of shag matchmate carpet samples, drinking tab on a blanket in the park with Tab Hunter as he touches my thigh, Sean Cassidy and Village People posters, Dadu Ron Ron and Magic Night. Pick me up in your Buick Skylark and take me to the clip joint. If I think enough about capitalists, I can whip myself up into sadness, guilt, and performative drama. Why does lighting have to be so good these days? I'd like to go back to when it was bad, when men liked the way I looked at 300 pounds. Paint my sugar walls baby blue, part my gold curtains, and decorate my room with brass accents and a matching blue velveteen sofa. Pick me up in your white 79 Corvette and take me to the throngs of Washington, DC. I fight off anti-abortion hecklers with their crosses and blown up posters of chopped fetuses. And I spray baby powder glade in their faces. For the Second Amendment defenders, festive fireside glow with its hints of amber, firewood, and smoke. Through the spittle of turf's exotic tropical blossoms. Eventually, I am seized by a proud boy I refuse to describe. He takes me to concrete, the sting of dirt in my thick-skinned knee. And I think of death, the Odorama card slipped into my ex-boyfriend's DVD. We scratched it and couldn't keep it because it smelled so rank. Proud boy trying to take me down. Aren't you so soft core? Why did you come here looking like that, looking at me? Try picking me up instead as credits roll with names of ghosts as an instrumental of a lonely Debbie Harry song plays. Is that the sting of gardenia in your eye? Think hard about it, proud boy, with your brain of pink, gray, macrame. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I've like, that last poem especially, I like lived all that stuff. So. Our seventh reader comes to us from Ottawa, Canada. I'm sorry, Ottawa, Ontario. We don't say New York, USA, right? And I don't want to make this, and I know I keep talking about me, but you know, I do that. But I don't want to make this all about me, but this is, I go back, my first, I haven't read a novel up forever, so don't bother looking for them, but my first novel came out 21 years ago, and the first review I ever had on Amazon was from Nathan Burgoyne. I was reminded in my Facebook memories today that 10 years ago today, I finished reading Nathan's first novel, Light. And I found it delightful, of course. I found I was about to say virtually everyone. That's the politician in me, always a qualifier. I have found everything that Nathan has written totally delightful. I'm really glad that he could join us today. Now he is an experienced novelist and short story writer, and he's very experimental, and he writes some really great stuff. And he hasn't come to the United States for a while. That had nothing to do with Trump, I'm sure, but we'll get him down here again one of these days. Anyway, his introduction now. Nathan Burgoyne by Marriage Smith, but I said we already have too many Smiths in the program, so he'd have to go by his writing name, Burgoyne. He's the author of the queer young adult novel Exit Plans for Teenage Freaks, which was a finalist for the Pre-Aurora Award for YA novel, and the queer young adult novella Hope Echoes, included in the collection Three Left Turns to Nowhere. Beyond writing, Nathan's worked in a sheet metal factory, on queer outreach, and is a bookstore manager. Nathan and his husband, Dan, and their rescue husky live in Ottawa, as I mentioned. And he's going to be reading something from his new book, Stuck with You. Nathan, take it away.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. I couldn't help myself from reaching back in the bookshelves. This is Rob's debut novel. You can still find them. Thank you again. So yeah, I am speaking to you from Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe. So thank you very much for inviting me from all the way up here. I know that Rob considers himself sort of an honorary Canadian, so I appreciate him extending his hand across the border for me. I am reading tonight from Stuck With You. So I'm going to break tradition. It's actually set like this year. I apologize to everyone who stayed in the 80s. But Lorimer Press has a series called Real Love, and they are specifically high-low YA novels. And for those of you who don't know what high-low is, basically it's high interest stories. So they're interesting stories for young adults. But low complexity. So they're aimed at perhaps English second language students or kids with reading disabilities or the like. And Lorimer realized that publishing being what it is, there weren't a lot out there about like queer people or other marginalized identities. So they reached out to some queer authors, and I had got to take the opportunity, and it was a fascinating ride to write something specifically for a high-low audience. So anyway, story takes place with two young men. They are on a train coming from Toronto to Ottawa. The main character, Ben, has just had the worst March break of his life because right before his March break, someone at school accidentally broke his phone. And so he had to spend an entire week with his father, who isn't super great, and didn't even have a way to contact his friends. So he's coming back on the train. And of course, who's the boy that gets to sit beside him on the train ride the entire way back, but the one who broke his phone? So they're stuck together. It's a rom-com. It's mostly queer joy, and we'll just jump right into it. There are a couple of stops on the train ride at this point. They have finally gotten past the fact that that Caleb broke the phone by accident, but Ben is still willing to needle him a little bit about it. And here we go. At the second GO station, someone got on board our car. Someone cute. He didn't have a hat, which was probably because he'd styled his hair to do this tall, curly thing that was impressive and probably took a lot of styling gunk. He had great eyebrows, dark eyes, and he had a really good chin, the kind with the dent in it. And even from where I was sitting, you could tell the guy had amazing eyelashes too. Altogether, seriously cute. He slung his messenger bag into the compartment, then sat, which ended my view. Here, Caleb said. He was holding out a napkin. What's that for? You got some drool right there? I do. Uh-huh, Caleb laughed. Go say hi. What? I mean it. Go take your shot. People do not take their shot on a train, Caleb, I said. That would be totally weird. Besides, I don't even know if the guy would be into another guy or pissed off at me for assuming he would. Had it ever even occurred to Caleb what it was like when you were queer like me? I doubted it. Caleb had been dating Emma Tremblay for over a year now. He had a pride pin on his jacket, Caleb said. I think you're safe. He did? I didn't see it. It was a maple leaf, Caleb said, but pride rainbow instead of red. I stared at him. Caleb stared right back, smirking. Caleb Curry did smug really well. So annoying. What? He said. I'm trying to figure out how you noticed a subtle pride pin. My uncle and his husband have the same pin. Oh, I said. You have a gay uncle? 2 of them. Caleb nodded. They're great. That's cool, I said. You don't sound like you mean that, Caleb said. Oh, no, I didn't know what to say. You just what? Honestly, I think I'm jealous. Oh, now I'd surprised him. Jealous of having queer uncles. I think it would have been nice, I said. Don't get me wrong, my mom handled it really well. And Mick too, his stepdad. I mean, my mom, she was great. And he's this big burly construction worker. So, I mean, you have to worry, right? But having someone out in the family would have been, I shook my head. I didn't even know where to begin imagining having someone who'd already faced all the stuff that was coming my way. Someone I could talk to who'd already been there. It just would have been cool. Your dad didn't handle it well? Caleb said. I guess he noticed I hadn't mentioned him. He didn't take it as well as my mom, I said, but he wasn't bad about it or anything. He was just surprised, which amazes me because... What? Caleb said. People have been calling me gay since I was 4 years old, Caleb, I said. They knew before I did. Really? Well, no, I don't think they were trying to be helpful, Caleb. They were just being... But people have always just seemed to know. Guys especially. I don't know, I've always figured it was my face. What about it? Caleb was staring now, like he was trying to figure out which part of my face exactly said gay. I don't really know, I said. I mean, my smile, maybe, or my ears. My teeth show too much, and my ears stick out. Caleb shook his head. You know, I think it's the drool on your chin when there's a cute guy. Shut up, I said, and then glanced at the back of cute guy's head. And you're wrong about people not taking shots on the train, by the way, Caleb said. My Uncle Scott met Uncle Gavin on the train. You are making that up, I said. Well, kind of. They met on the TTC, but it's still a train. Caleb crossed his arms like he'd won some sort of victory. He really was annoying. And every time he crossed his arms, I couldn't help staring at his biceps. I highly doubt your uncle randomly approached some guy on the TTC, I said. Well, it was right after Pride, Caleb said. Gavin had a rainbow painted on his face. I'm like, oh, well, okay, sure, fine. That's completely different, obviously. How? Caleb pointed. That guy has a rainbow on his jacket. So you can go take your shot. Please stop saying that, I said. It's not going to happen. Why not? Caleb said. Because I like to keep my monthly humiliation down to a minimum, and you already maxed it out with 1 basketball throw, remember? Oh my God. Caleb threw his head back, laughing. Let it go, Benny. It was an accident. Go say hi. You're obsessed with the cute boy, I said. Why don't you go talk to him? Is that a dare? What? Is that a dare? Caleb said. Sure, I said. It's totally a dare. Caleb Corey, go talk to the cute guy. Caleb uncrossed his arms and shook out his wrists, turning his head left and right, and then making his neck pop. Ugh. He unzipped his hoodie. What are you doing? I said. Caleb just smiled at me, pulling off the hoodie. Underneath, he had on a plain white t-shirt. It was really unfair how good he looked in a plain white t-shirt. It showed off how wide his shoulders already were, and his arms were even more impressive than before once you could see the curve of his biceps do that thing to the edges of his sleeves. When I wore a white t-shirt, I looked like I'd forgotten to pack a sweater. Caleb stood up. Caleb, I said, what are you doing? Seriously. He said, I'm taking my shot, Benny. Caleb Curry winked at me and started off down the aisle of the train car towards the cute guy. And there you go.
Yeah.
you, Nathan, and so good to see you after all these years. Come on down and visit us again. And Nathan, as a YA writer, not exclusively, but largely as a YA writer, reminds me, by the way, that this year the Publishing Triangle is introducing, I should say, our first, the Jacqueline Woodson Award for YA and children's literature. We understand those are two different disciplines, but baby steps, okay? This is going to be a great award, and if we could split them at some point down the line, we will, but for right now, we're excited. Jacqueline Woodson is excited. Right now, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but it looks like we might have a date for our award ceremony in April 18th. It's not totally in stone yet, but we'll let you know. Follow us on social media. I should add to, like this reading, like everything we do, our award ceremony and the reception that follows are 100% free. So we do encourage our community to come and join us because, you could go, and I have no axe to grind with any other group. I give other queer literature groups lots of money to support them. So I'm there with them. But, our award ceremony is not going to set you back $500, okay? I'm just saying. And again, not a slam on anyone. We all just have our different way. We don't have a paid staff. It's me, Carol, 5 other people, Chris, 5 other people right now that are doing all this. So the more reason you should pay your $40 a year to be a member. Our final reader tonight, and we're very excited. One of my favorite people that I didn't know 5 months ago, but I've gotten to know quite well over the last 5 months. Nina Kennedy is a world-renowned concert pianist, orchestral conductor, and an award-winning filmmaker. She holds a master's degree from the Juilliard School and this year was one of Crane's notable LGBTQ business leaders for this year. She's the host of the Noshing with Nina show, an award-winning cable television talk show produced at Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And her first book came out last year, and it was Practicing for Love, a memoir, and it was a Lambda Literary Award finalist. Her most recent book her first book, I'm sorry, Nina, 2021 was when your first book came out. Her second book came out in 2022, Practice What You Preach. If you're practicing for love, practice what you preach. If you're getting a piano theme in your head, you got it. But that was published last year, and we're so glad our final reader for the night is Nina Kennedy. Nina, come on down.
Thank you, Rob. I'm so glad to be here. Good to see everybody. So this is from Practicing for Love. I'm starting when I'm leaving Philadelphia to come to the Big Apple. The last days in Philly were filled with saying goodbye to my friends and several bon voyage parties. Eventually, I finished packing, loaded up my little Subaru, and drove to New York City all by myself. Somehow, I made a wrong turn on the way to the Lincoln Tunnel and ended up approaching the Holland Tunnel. The Twin Towers, magnificently illuminated, stood to greet me on the occasion of my arrival to my new home. The next chapter is Start Spreading the News. My first day in the Big Apple, I had filed the paperwork for the transfer of funds from my bank accounts in Philadelphia to my new account in New York. A couple of days later, I had run out of the cash that I had and attempted to make a withdrawal at the bank when I was informed that the transfer was not complete and the funds were not available. When I asked the teller when I would be able to withdraw cash, she said it would be within the next couple of days, hopefully. As I didn't have a credit card, this marks the only time in my life when I did not know where my next meal was coming from. It was the only time I went to bed hungry. The next day, the transfer was complete, so I treated myself to breakfast at a traditional New York City diner. One of the first things I did after settling into my new home was to find my way to the nearest women's bar. The Duchess used to be on the corner of 7th Avenue and Christopher Street in the West Village. I had even made my way there when I came to town on one of those preliminary trips to search for housing. I remember seeing a young, tall, black, beautiful woman, usually standing toward the back of the bar. I didn't know her name, but she was there frequently. Lost myself here. Okay. There we go. A few years later, when I ran into one of the bartenders from the Duchess, she said to me, "Yeah, you used to come in back when Whitney Houston used to hang out. She used to be there all the time." Whitney Houston. I knew her face looked familiar when her first album came out, but I'd seen her at the bar and she wasn't wearing any makeup. In fact, she looked a little butch in her leather jacket and her hair pulled back. It was such a tragedy to lose her the way we did. Several have said, including her ex-husband, that if she'd been free to live her truth, she might not have become addicted to drugs in the first place. The pressure to be married to a man and to stay in the closet took its toll on her psyche daily. Robin Crawford was her support system and never should have been forced to leave her side. I learned just recently that young Vladimir Horowitz used to put on makeup and hang out in the sailors' bars in the port cities of Europe. His friend and mentor, Sergei Rachmaninoff, used to give him a hard time about being gay and told him to stop. It always amazes me how some heterosexuals think that being gay is a choice. The only actual choice is to be gay and be happy, or pretend to be straight or celibate and be miserable. Which would you choose? I fully took advantage of being so close to the theater district and Lincoln Center. That first semester, I would treat myself to a Broadway play per week, purchasing discounted tickets for students. I attended New York Philharmonic concerts as often as I could. One evening, pianist Alicia de la Roja was giving a concert at Avery Fisher Hall. I had gotten a last-minute student ticket for a seat in the second box on the left, keyboard side. At some point during the intermission, several people on the main floor were pointing up to the box next to mine. I asked a woman sitting next to me what they were pointing at. She said, "That's Vladimir Horowitz sitting over there." I couldn't believe my ears. Horowitz, my idol. I sprang over to him without hesitation. His bodyguard came over right away. "Oh, Mr. Horowitz, I'm so happy to meet you," I gushed. "I'm studying at Juilliard. You know, I've studied your arrangement of the Rachmaninoff Second Sonata and found a copy of the original edition. So I'm putting the two versions together like you did." The old man then peered up at me and made no response. "May I please have your autograph?" I handed him my program and a pen. The bodyguard then put his arm between my program and Horowitz's shoulder. "Mr. Horowitz does not sign autographs," he barked. "Oh, well, may I shake your hand then?" The old man slowly raised his finger for me to hold, which I did. Later, I learned in one of his biographies that Horowitz refused to shake hands with strangers because of an incident early in his career when a man shook his hand so hard that it affected his playing that night. I began to think about erecting my own boundaries where handshaking was concerned. At the end of the concert, while she was still receiving her ovation, Madame de la Roja looked up to the first box and acknowledged the presence of Mr. Horowitz, who waved back. After the concert, I went backstage to congratulate Madame de la Roja and learned while overhearing her conversations with friends that her husband had just died recently. The tears would well up in her eyes as she spoke. I could see that she didn't have much patience with autograph seekers and fans, but I made a point of looking into her eyes and complimenting her work from one pianist to another. She took the time to engage with me, which was most gratifying. Life in Manhattan was super expensive. Fortunately, I was still engaged to give recitals throughout the country, but it wasn't bringing in enough to cover all my expenses. By then, it was clear to me that the various conductors with whom I had worked did the hiring as far as soloists were concerned. So I made the logical decision to enroll in the conductor's program while completing the requirements for the Master of Music degree in piano performance, which was how I was able to participate in Leonard Bernstein's master classes. I'm going to skip ahead here to the next chapter. So my second year at Juilliard. When it was time to return to Juilliard in late August, I rented a room in an apartment in Spanish Harlem. A women's bookstore was around the corner from where I lived. And on their bulletin board, I saw an announcement of the New England Women's Music Retreat, NUMR, which was taking place over the Labor Day weekend. Women left signs offering and asking for rides, so I took down a few numbers and contacted them. I didn't have much camping equipment. In fact, all I had was a sleeping bag. Soon after we arrived and set up the communal tent, I saw a woman I had met a few months earlier strolling through the woods in her little purple shorts, topless. She was out to have a good time. We had met and danced at Ariel's bar in New York earlier that year. When I said hello to her, she told me later that she actually hadn't recognized me. I reminded her of our dance and our conversation at Ariel's, and she said, of course she remembered, but in fact, she hadn't. She just said that she did because she thought I was cute. By the end of the conversation, Susan and I were definitely an item. Back in New York, I would go to school during the day while she was at work, and we would spend the night together at her apartment. I gave up my rented room and moved into Susan's place after paying for 3 months' rent and spending maybe 10 nights there. Susan Seltzer was a systems programmer at the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company when I met her. Later, she would take a position at Morgan Guaranty Trust on Wall Street. She loved the fact that I was a classical musician and knew that her parents would be impressed by this as well. In fact, soon after I met her father, we discovered that we both loved Mahler's symphonies. At her parents' house, her dad and I would sit in the living room blasting the music, or we would take off for the golf course. In a way, I was the son he never had. Susan's mother, however, was another story. She was a very controlling woman, and Susan was terrified of her disapproval and her anger. She made it clear that she was going to be the boss of Susan's life, regardless of who her significant other was. Meanwhile, Susan was teaching me what it meant to be loved unconditionally. I didn't need to ask for material things. She would anticipate what I needed and buy it without question. I had never experienced this kind of love from my parents. Every little thing I had asked them for, the immediate answer was no. Eventually, it may have shown up in some way or other, but they seemed to feel the need to teach me that I would not receive what I asked for. To this day, I still struggle with asking for what I need. Susan was a fascinating woman. She had spent several years living on a kibbutz in Israel, where she studied at the Hebrew University. She was an avid reader and enjoyed foreign films. She was one of the smartest people I had ever met. It was 1983, and I had never really used a computer before. As a systems programmer, of course, she had one, and she completely computerized me. Suddenly, I had mailing lists and address labels and a database. I could send personalized letters to conductors and artist manager all over the world. Susan socialized with corporate types who did their 9-to-5 jobs and then came home to relax. It seemed my work was never ending. I would spend my days in class, practice for a few hours in between, and my evenings on the computer adding to my mailing lists, writing my biographical sketches, and composing letters to solicit engagements. Susan was easily paying the bills. Her job as a corporate systems programmer made this possible. I wanted to contribute something toward my expenses. So I put an ad in a neighborhood newspaper offering piano lessons. I received several responses, but one stood out. She called during the evening, an elderly woman. I really want some voice coaching in addition to the piano lesson, she said. That's the nigger in the woodpile. Excuse me? She was stupid enough to repeat it. I said, that's the nigger in the woodpile. I hung up. Days later, when I told my parents about the conversation, my father immediately jumped to her defense. Oh, you shouldn't have let that upset you, he cried. It's as if his brain automatically kept him from feeling any sense of outrage. Perhaps as a young Black man in rural Georgia during the Depression, his lack of any sense of outrage saved his life. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Nina Kennedy, and that, yes, more applause. Actually, applause for all. There, I got it. The whole team though, William Christie Smith, Michael Thomas Ford, Ellen Zweig, Robin Geigel, Dale Corbino, Jeffrey, you think I had this memorized, right? Jeffrey Berg, Nathan Burgoyne, and Nina Kennedy. What a great lineup this was. Nina mentioned, being an fairly early adapter to the whole concept of mailing lists, and that reminds me, I want all of you on our mailing list that are in this room and that are watching on YouTube right now, and that are watching on YouTube in 3 years. Because although if you're watching 3 years from now, if you're sitting there in 2026 watching this, you really should examine your life a little bit too. But email publishingtriangle@gmail.com. Just say mailing list. That's all. We will put you on. And every month now, we started this in September. Every month we're sending out, hopefully on the first-ish, member volunteers. But we're going to get a bulletin out to tell you all the things that are going on with us and with other with partners in our community. So be there with us. It's hopefully going to be a great journey. One thing I forgot to mention too is one of our board members, Emmanuel Xavier, has a new book of poetry, and he will be launching it 2 weeks from today on Thursday, October 26th, here at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. So come on by and join in, and Greg and Donnie, and buy books. And I'm done. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all
Good
for not
night.
hanging on.